Well, welcome everyone that's here.
Yeah,
Welcome,
we have
Jeremy.
2 or 4 people
Thank
coming.
you.
All the important people have arrived.
There you go.
That's right.
Okay. So today we're starting on a new book, Beyond Belief, The Secret Gospel of Thomas. And chapter 1, from the Feast of Agape to the Nicene Creed, kind of gives you an introduction, but you don't really get into the Gospel of Thomas until chapter 2, which Jane's going to do. So a little bit about Elaine Pagels, who wrote the book. She got her PhD from Harvard in 1970. While she was there, she was on a team that studied the Nag manuscripts. According to Wikipedia, she still teaches at Princeton, but she's got to be 80 plus.
Yeah.
She's written several books on the Gnostic Gospels, and yeah, Jane's got that. But the Gnostic Gospels won the National Book Award in Religion, and also another award, the National Book Critics Circle Award. And this chapter starts off talking about her son. He died at age 6.5 and had been ill for 5 years. And then the next year, her husband died in a mountain climbing accident. And then later, she married a law professor. So she's had a fair amount of tragedy in her life already. So this is where she starts in her book. She says she was on a morning run and she stepped into this Church of Heavenly Rest in New York. And she just learned that her 2.5-year-old son had this rare disease that later he died from. So what thought crossed her mind when she entered the church? She
ought to be there. Those people were at peace and they were going through stuff too. But,
yeah.
She happened to stop by while she was running. And I think I know I read this part, but she kind of felt that she belonged there and that she felt peace.
Yeah. Well, in her situation, she was looking for something, and she found this group there. It says, and then I have a question from: what has attracted outsiders to join a gathering of Christians?
Talked about community. Yeah. I think community and hope.
Yeah.
And then when she talked about the early Christians, people were amazed that they were, healing people without asking for payment, so that was something that was something really different about Christians and the early Christians.
So what she said also was this group had joined spiritual power in an extended family. So that was kind of what she said. And newcomers to Christian meetings hope. She said, hope for a miracle. Some found one, but even if they didn't get a miracle, they got some kind of relief or help. This is the Church of Heavenly Rest in New York. So you see it on the left there and inside. Well, Tertullian, he was a Christian writer in the 2nd century. And like Jane pointed out, he said that other societies and groups collected money, but the Christians voluntarily gave money to a common fund. I thought it was interesting. Support orphans, buy food, medicine, even coffins to bury the poor and criminals. I thought that was kind of interesting. And this generosity attracted people, even though in his time there were risks with being in this subversive group. And then she pointed out even in the second century, there was a plague, and most people were leaving town wherever they could go to escape, hoping to escape the virus. But Christians stayed to care for the sick and dying. And I wonder, why did Christians act in these extraordinary ways?
Well, Christianity taught them empathy and taught them that, they're doing good for others was a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Love your neighbor as yourself.
Okay.
Jesus taught him in his message, you do this to another person who's done it to me.
Okay. Well, one thing they said was they received the strength or to do this from the way Pagel wrote it, from their encounter with divine power, not a power different than what the pagan gods who were acting in their own self-interest. And like Paul just said, their God loved human beings and required human beings to love one another and help the needy. So she says this conviction became the practical basis of a radical new social structure. And so my question is that a radical new structure? What was it, or what is it now?
She kind of pointed out that in the time, the people who were the religious practitioners for other gods charged money for their services.
Yeah.
So they would, and actually it was a big business. And the Christians, would help you for free.
Yeah. Well, is this radical new social structure, is that the church? Okay.
The first thing is spring porch in full form. And I think a couple of centuries.
So is the church still a radical structure, or has it been domesticated?
I would say it's
Why would you say that?
because we have all these rules we have to follow, and it's been to me, some of the churches are more interested in saving themselves rather than working with the people.
Okay. Okay.
They're basically an insulin community.
Mhm.
Some of the churches are radical social structures and some are social structures for radicals.
Where do we fall? Both.
I guess the shoe fits.
Sometimes I think nowadays we get more by something.
Yeah.
Jeremy, I don't know if you heard Sharon. She said sometimes we can intellectualize our theology to where the point we don't have to do anything. Well, this Tertullian said, what marks us in the eyes of our enemies is our practice of loving kindness. And Christians were ridiculed for referring to one another as brother or sister. Do you remember when President Vesey, this might have been his first presidential sermon, where he was basically said he wanted to return to people referring to each other as brother and sister again. We that used to be real prominent.
My dad still does it. Oh, brother, he always says that to his friends when he sees them.
Just church members or other friends also?
No, I think in the church.
Okay.
Yeah,
Because
I don't think he does it to his secular
Talking
friends.
about how Christianity has changed. I've in a couple of Christian Facebook groups, that I follow to see what people are saying, and I know there's a lot of criticism that Christianity seems like it's more about believing than the doing. Apparently, in the first century, it was about the doing and taking care of others, and then she talks creed and it becomes more about the creed. rather than walking
Yeah.
along.
Yeah.
If the
Well-
doing's radical, that's where we need to be.
Well, what do you think of this? What matters in religious experience involves much more than what we believe or don't believe. So on this, you know, agree with that? What matters to you? And the next one is exactly what Paul just said, more or less.
Well, I think I've said this before in this class, the word believe implies what we're hoping for. We all hope for things, but you know, what are we doing to make it happen?
Yeah.
I was reading this morning on the internet that the Southern Baptists are getting ready to have their reunion, I mean, their conference type thing. And one of the things that they're planning on voting on is making a constitutional ban on women in to be pastors or associate pastors in the churches. And I guess they kind of had it as a thing last conference, but they didn't make it mandatory. But they lost several of their churches that had women as pastors, and so they're anticipating losing more this time if they make it official.
So like a church-wide ban?
So
Not
we
the-
said constitutional. I thought you
Yeah.
meant
Yeah,
our
I did too when I
Constitution.
first read it, but
Okay, that
it's
makes
in
more
their,
sense. How in the world
in
did we
their,
get it?
In their rules of
Yeah.
operation.
their church hierarchy.
I didn't realize they had women pastors, so that's
Yeah,
good, that's good. Yeah.
In what church?
Southern
Baptist.
Baptist.
The more liberal.
Maybe they're not
Southern.
Southern Baptist.
Non-affiliated folks.
I see more on it now. They have women as pastors and. You know, when I read that first sentence, I think of my Jewish friends
Okay.
and I think they are very religious.
Mhm. Okay.
And so just because they believe differently than I do. I think that there's a very healthy religious experience.
Well, she points out that Christianity was existed for like 3 or 4 centuries before it actually adopted a formal creed, and it flourished. Evidently, a creed wasn't essential to the flourishing of Christianity. This is says it was the 4th century that the Nicene Creed was formulated. And I can't read that tiny print on the side, but that's the whole creed there. I can read on my screen if you want. It says, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. I believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, born of the Father before all ages, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made. Here's a big word, consubstantial with the Father. Through him all things were made. For us men and for our salvation, he came down from heaven and by the Holy Spirit was incarnate of the Virgin Mary and became man. For our sake, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He suffered death and was buried and rose again on the 3rd day in accordance with the scripture. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. He will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son, who with the Father and the Son is adored and glorified, who has spoken through the prophet. I believe in one holy Catholic and apostolic church. I confess one baptism for the forgiveness of sins, and I look forward to the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. Amen. So that's the creed, the Nicene Creed. Now, as I recall, this is kind of trivia, but a big split occurred in like 1,000 or something like that over how the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, and there was some dispute about one word in there, and that was caused a big split. Anyway,
A couple of weeks ago, I think you guys were out gallivanting and hopefully on your vacation. But we had Trinity Sunday here, and I read part of that for the congregation, and it was interesting because by the time they created this final creed, I mean, it went through some different versions. It was really all about that Holy Spirit and what it meant to, the 3-in-1 thing concept of, they were worried that they were now believing in multiple gods. And we've studied all that before, but that it's like, no, this is 3-in-1. And everybody was trying to I find it fascinating that time of our world. And they were really trying to figure out what Christianity meant to them,
Say that again, Dorothy?
yeah, speak louder.
There was one guy on the
The Nicene Creed conference.
that was wanted to undeified.
Right, human. He was human.
Right. And was jailed for doing that. For punching. For punching. Not for assault.
No.
That Santa Claus? Santa Claus did that?
Person in
That's
the
Santa
movie.
Claus.
Yeah, he wasn't tainted yet. He wasn't tainted.
Santa Claus punched a guy in the face. I like that story.
Well, this not-
Yeah,
It's on
there's-
his
there's-
naughty list forever.
There's some of this that I can kind of go along with, but the one statement always bothered me. I believe in the one true and holy Roman Catholic Church, and that's it.
He doesn't say,
He doesn't say
Says
that.
Okay,
Holy
Catholic.
Catholic and
It's
Apostolic.
Catholic with a small C, which is basically Christian.
Universal Church. There wasn't any others though.
Well, I mean, that's,
In their defense,
Yeah.
it was the only one.
Substitute the religion of your choice.
Yeah.
Maybe Jesus is on the left side.
Well, this is making God and Jesus and all that anthropomorphic again, which we talked about that.
Oh, yeah.
Is God like a human being? So for Pagels, faith doesn't mean assent to a belief in the creed that a lot of churches still recite. Anybody can give a concise statement of what faith means to them?
Concise.
I heard it a lot.
What, the
What did you
Nicene
hear?
Creed?
Oh,
Okay.
And they use that word Catholic. And the Lutheran Church reads this also as a part of their service.
Well, does faith mean, for me, it's more like, rather than beliefs, it's like trust. I guess I would probably go with that.
I was trying to remember, Dennis, maybe you do, when Joseph Smith was asked whether we were a creedal church, and he said no, but then he offered a statement of belief that was almost word for word the Nicene Creed. Do you recall that, when that was?
Well, that's a point we bring up. I think our church says our creed is all truth. That if we have a creed, that's as close as we come.
This was something that.
But this was, I think you're talking about the Wentworth letter that he wrote to some newspaper, I think in Chicago, and that was in like the early 1840s. And there makes several statements about we believe this, like we don't believe in original sin. That was one that I particularly remember. But it was kind of like, it was a statement of beliefs.
Yeah.
We believe this, this, and this. That's one. Okay, so then she jumps into about baptism. according to Pagels, that non-Christian families often rejected those who joined the Christian movement
Yeah, that was a sad story about the,
of Perpetua.
yeah,
Yeah,
So they thought of these Christians as criminals, according to Pagels. Why were they viewed as criminals? I mean, that seems kind of, I mean, difficult to believe.
I know
Really?
Bart Ehrman talks about this, and he said there's a couple of possible reasons. One is they were just spreading bad information to talk down the Christian movement, kind of like the Nazis did with the Jews. You know, they eat babies or whatever it is.
Yeah, that was
Stuff that they were making up.
one thing.
And so the other thing is there may have, in some cases, been genuine misunderstandings about what the Christians were doing, especially with relative to Cooper, because, you know, they were saying we're eating body and blood of Christ, and so, you know, word gets out and people think they're practicing
Killing
cannibalism.
Well, they were also not following all the traditions of the Jewish, you know, that they had to do, you know, this and this and this. The early Christians had broken away from that, so.
I would also add to that was, and this is what, with the Romans. For the Romans, you know, their own Christians were almost atheists. In fact, I think they were still considered atheists because they didn't worship all the gods that the Romans worshiped. And they viewed them as, you know, against the Roman traditions. There's the Jewish aspect, but there's also the Romans, you know, you're going against what we do. This is, you know.
Well, after Jesus was crucified, the early Christians were actually it was against the law for them to meet, and they had to meet in secret. So that would make it criminal.
Then we have this story about Perpetua, a young woman. She decided to be baptized. The judge, he was evidently hauled before a court, and the judge asked her if she was Christian, and she said she was. And for that, she was arrested, imprisoned, and sentenced to be killed in the public arena. This is, I mean, I got this.
cool.
She had a husband, an infant son, and a slave named Felicitas. It was Carthage then, they call it Tunis now in Tunisia. But North Africa was a center of a vibrant Christian community. This article said, you know, they don't really know how she came to be a Christian or how long she was. She didn't live long. She was pretty young when she was put in the public arena. But they know a little bit about her. She had a diary, and some other prisoner gives us some idea of her last days. Here she is in the public arena.
He seems calm.
Yeah. So, what did her father do? What was his reaction? What did he do? And what would you do if you were in his shoes? Here's your daughter.
Yeah, that part of the story really struck me because he was just heartbroken. I mean, he tried 3 times to change her mind. Just say you're not a Christian. I mean, he's trying to save her.
Right.
yeah.
And you know, I mean, I really felt for him because I get from the parents' perspective, you know, I mean, just lie, do something to save yourself because he didn't want to lose her. He loved her so much, and she recognized that, and she said I guess it was in her diary, my father really loves me, but that wasn't enough for her. She had to stay.
What was her response? You've talked about part of it.
She said, my father really loves me, but I cannot turn my back on this, on who I am. This is who I am.
She grieved for his misery in old age.
There you go. Great.
Felt sorry for him, but she went through with it.
Martyrdom was big in early Christianity.
So eventually she more or less executed, I guess you'd say, in the public arena along with her slave Callistus. So when you became a Christian, first, before you were baptized, you pledged to live as a transformed person. I thought that was an interesting requirement there. And then the baptism, we don't do this anymore. You don't go into the baptismal font naked. But you took off your old clothes. I mean, there's some symbolism here. You
Yeah.
take off your old clothes, kind of like, I'm changing my life. These old clothes are, then you're immersed, you emerge wet and naked, you're born again, and they give you new clothes. And then as an infant, kind of representing an infant Christian, you're fed milk and honey. And then you participate in the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, or communion, whatever you want to call it, in the new family you're a member of. So that's a little different what we do today. Well, Pagels found, she hadn't attended church in decades, I think. And she said she started participating and she found a different experience of worship than what she, I guess, had experienced when she was much younger. But she had thought these were empty rituals, but now she saw that they could bring people together that were wide diversity of people and bring them into a united community. So do we see people of diverse backgrounds in our church today, in our congregation?
Not that much in congregation, but world church.
World church, okay.
I've often said to people that I'm friends with people that would have no business, no interest in being friends with me. And I've often thought of, like Roger Parrish. I mean, I'm not sure. No, I'm making a joke there, but he's up here intellectually. You're up here intellectually. But you guys are still willing to be friends with me just because we have a common faith. And so, yes, I think that we do. And I appreciated the church growing up, being exposed and being loved by people that I viewed as, very, very intellectually above me.
That's what brought me into the church. Because when we were in Wichita, it was nothing for him to be on the other end of picking up a couch to somebody who was a CEO of, the airplane manufacturer out there, or bank president. And, he just took that as being loved into the church.
Okay.
Piggyback on that, I think that is a heartache as parents. A lot of us have that our kids don't have that.
Mhm.
And I think somehow to reach that generation that they are lacking exactly that, Robin.
Well, what I read, a lot of people say young people are looking to belong. I notice Graceland University emphasizes a lot belonging and community. They just are not looking at the church for that sense of belonging and community, it seems like.
I don't know where they find it though. I've witnessed my children, 36 and 38 now. And I think it's lacking.
Did anybody read in the paper? This was, I think, it's probably been a week or so ago. Here in Kansas City, this guy sort of wanted to have a community, so he started a runner's group.
Oh, yeah.
And he
What?
put out on social media that he was going to run on such a such and such a time and such a place. And it kind of started out, a few people joining. Now there's hundreds now that are involved with his running club. They don't really go there necessarily because they want to run or like to run. Some of them do, some of them don't. But they're part of this community. That's kind of what they did.
There you go. That's how they build community.
It's the same with motorcycle groups and,
Right.
you know, most
Biking
anything that
clubs.
has a central
Right, Diane?
interest.
Okay.
Square dancing.
I don't know how long they've done it, but the incoming freshmen, they form communities of like 20 to 24 kids. And they will have 3 classes together. And
Oh, okay.
do social things together to get them mixed with,
At the high schools, is that what you?
no, at K-State.
At K-State.
I think one thing the church offers that most of these other things don't is a multi-generational family. You know, so the young people get experience with grandparents or, you know. And most organizations, it's hard to find that. So when our kids age out of their running club, like
When they're all
my
years
people,
old.
you know, yeah. Or even when the kids aren't at home,
Or scouts.
you know, they,
So you're seeing it in multi-generational effect. Otherwise, they're kind of homogeneous age-wise.
yeah.
So Karen, I went to the gay pride parade yesterday with a couple of friends of mine. One was gay, one was not. And they asked me when I told them I was still involved in church. Their very first question to me was, do you find community there? Because they left their churches because they couldn't find community there. I mean, my gay friend grew up in a Southern Baptist church, very, very conservative church. And so she searched, she rattled off 4 different churches she tried to go to in order to find community. And she couldn't find it, you know.
Did you invite her?
Well, I'm at the beginning stages of inviting, okay? You know.
Sorry.
Yes, we're gonna get together again. How about that?
Yeah,
Yeah. But I know, I actually did think about that, you know, but you know, that is something that we have to think about in this congregation.
Well, and
You
you
know?
assume that every church has community, but obviously that's a.
Well,
valid
there's a lot of
assumption.
people that sit on the back seat and walk out the door as soon as the service is over. And how are you gonna become a part of the community if that's how you go to church?
Or now they stay at home and watch it on TV.
I got one more thing to say to feedback on Karen is my children now have good presence. You know, they're able to speak in front of people. And I had always told them, when are you ever going to know that when you get to speak, you have a whole room of people that are rooting for you,
Yeah.
that love you, and they want you to be successful. And it was good training for my children.
Yeah.
And you know, then they were able to get up and talk to whole rooms, auditoriums full of people through that training because it gave them the experience.
Okay.
Did they recognize it too?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
good.
Well, I'm going to ask this question. So how does, or what does these rituals of baptism and communion mean? And what does it mean to join, or how does that relate to community? And then I'll go on down to the next one. Does it mean the same thing now as it did 2,000 years ago?
I think some of it does, but not all of it is the same as 2,000 years ago. I think we've seen a kind of movement in the churches that, you know, originally it was, you got to join so that you'll be saved for the next life. And we don't talk that much about salvation anymore. Now we're talking more about what you're doing today in the world and not what's going to get you here. You know, it may be the same thing, but the emphasis is not on salvation like it used to be.
When you say used to be, are you talking about 2,000 years ago or 50 years ago?
Well, 50 years ago.
Okay.
You know, it just, and I don't know how much they did 2,000 years ago. I don't know how much they emphasized that in their ministries and such, but I've really noticed, you know, in our church how, you know, it used to be, well, you got to get to this kingdom and this kingdom and this, and you know, that's gone. And you used to, well, you need to join because, you know, you need to know, you know, what's going on, and it's not there that anymore. It's a different emphasis.
Well, one thing this book is going to be about is that using the Gospel of Thomas, that we've learned that there were other groups of Christians who didn't interpret baptism and communion in the same way. There were different interpretations. One of these sources was the Didache,
Glad you pronounced that for us.
and it was written for any of the 4 Gospels we have in the New Testament.
Why do you think it didn't get in the Bible? Any thoughts?
Well,
It was
I
written
think
before Mark, according to Pagels. That surprised me. I went and looked it up and it's like, oh,
yeah. I think the Orthodox view came in, and that wasn't the Orthodox view, basically. But so according to the Didache, the Christians were still part of the Jewish people.
right.
They thought of themselves as
Jewish.
Jews who revered Jesus as a
Yeah.
great interpreter of the Torah. And the Didache means teaching in Greek, and it's called the teaching of the 12 apostles to the Gentiles. And then it has this, which we talked about the path of the disciple and that today, but there was this way of life. You know, the Christians were called the way, but this Didache used the 10 Commandments and sayings of Jesus, and this is one of the first things that the Didache opens up with. Which is kind of a negative approach to the golden rule. Instead of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, do not do unto others
What you don't want.
what you don't want done to you. Which either way, it kind of works out the same, but it's
Well, and they said that's, somebody asked Hillel, that's basically what he said, because he was supposed to distill it, say it while he was standing on one leg.
right.
And so don't do to others what you don't want them to do. So was he an apostle?
Who?
Didache?
No, Didache
That's
is a manuscript.
A manuscript. Oh. And who wrote it? I'm confused. Sorry.
Well, just like the Gospels, nobody really knows who wrote it.
It's not attributed to anybody. It's almost like a book of sayings. It's almost like somebody wrote it together. Like this is, and it does say this is what Jesus said. So they're quoting Jesus in it, just like Mark did, because Mark was the first gospel writer, you know. But I think, yeah, it had a little bit more of a Jewish influence. And she also talked about how it didn't have any Pauline influences, which I thought was interesting. So it's like the Jewish people are just trying to figure out what Jesus was saying. It was early. I find
Jeremy,
it
did you have
fascinating.
something?
Not really.
Okay,
So I think the Didache really came out of the early Jewish Christian movement,
right.
which sort of lost out to Paul.
Right,
And, you know, it was Paul's movement and his
Right.
taking the church, the Christian church away from the Jews
yeah,
and giving it to the Gentiles that probably diminished the importance of it.
yeah.
So all of the Gospels, even the four Gospels, were written by probably Greek Jews, not by people from Jerusalem, like the Didache Gospels.
I like this first point where the dedicate urges people to be perfect, but if you can't be perfect, do what you can.
I like that too. It's like, let's throw that in.
Sounds very
That
Jewish.
would have saved
Do what you can.
growing up.
Yeah.
And honestly, that's what I teach students every day, so
I know.
that's more truthful than
Yeah,
anything
be
we've ever been put upon.
That one messed us up.
I know,
So,
my mother was into perfection.
Yeah.
so this,
Perfection gets you nowhere.
I know.
so this is the view of the dedicate towards baptism, which is, like Paul was saying, is much more Jewish approach. The mikveh is a bath that was to purify Gentiles who wanted to become part of the Jewish people. So the dedicate kind of looked at it from that standpoint.
Yeah.
Do Jews baptize?
Well, they have
Yes.
oh, go ahead, Jeremy.
There is some baptism that is associated with the Jews. I don't remember all the details though.
It's a
the
purification, right? It
Yeah.
looks just like a baptismal font.
Yeah.
When you're taken into the Jewish faith, then you have to do that ritual. So
It's a
I
cleansing-
think that's
it's a cleansing
basically
ritual.
where baptism came from.
Yeah.
The idea of
It's the
being
mikvah.
purified, and then, you know, of course, Christianity is attached to other meanings
Mhm,
to baptism that the Jews wouldn't probably recognize, but
mhm.
So they have to go through the mikvah, but they also have mikvahs for Jews that, you know, who are, that they participate in. I know when my niece got married, she had a mikvah before her marriage.
you can go online and find pictures of the ancient, the Jewish community where John the Baptist supposedly came from. And there's all kinds of ritual bathing
Right.
fonts that are still there. You can actually see them in stone.
Well, and if you look up on the internet, you can find mikvahs that are available in different communities currently.
The other thing they were talking about was Lord's Supper. The way the Didache looked at it, celebrating how God brought people together who had been scattered. And so here's out of the Didache, as this broken bread was scattered upon the mountains, but was brought together and became one loaf. So let your people be gathered together from the ends of the earth into thy kingdom.
Is that
That's
almost
very
everything?
different.
Well, I kind of like it because it has a kingdom orientation.
Yeah.
And this is a different point of view about Jesus. Jesus is God's servant, and they believe that his coming signaled Israel's restoration at the end of time. Well, I don't know if that happened.
Probably the reason why he didn't make it into the Bible.
But there were other groups, and this is that Paul was talking about earlier, other early followers get that out, of Jesus saw sharing bread and wine as eating human flesh and drinking human blood as commanded by Jesus. Take this.
Yeah.
This is my body. This is my blood. And I've always puzzled about that because for Jewish people, if they're really kosher, you know, the Old Testament says you drain the blood.
Yeah.
So how did this belief develop? I can't see how it developed among the Jews myself, but anybody got some? I speculate that it developed among the Gentiles, and since they became the dominant
Because of
group.
the sacrificial, it's all about sacrificing. To me, it's all about that sacrificial lamb concept that people were trying to wrap their heads around as they were transitioning into Christianity. He had to be John. I know I'm jumping ahead, but the book of John Jesus had to be the sacrificial lamb. That was important to Christianity, you know.
But even then, you were supposed to drain the blood according to.
Yeah, I know.
Well, they say in there it was offensive. It's offensive to me, really, to think of it that way myself.
I never understood transubstantiation to this day, because I don't get it.
So, anybody want to share how they view communion?
I
Symbolizing.
was always
Yeah.
thought that they were symbols, called
The-
symbols.
Emblems,
Yeah.
symbols.
Symbols.
We never practiced transubstantiation.
True.
Bread and wine, the emblematic or symbolic. Body and blood.
And that he was recognizing his own sacrifice when, you know, I always like to, this book always kind of challenges me because, you know, I didn't realize that the synoptic gospels had it on a different night. I had to go back and look at it. Then, you know, so because John made it actually the day before Passover so that Jesus was the symbol of the sacrifice, you know, to
Right.
kind of usurp the Jewish Passover meal.
John made the story fit to make people want it.
He did. And he made it fit so that Christianity, but we still, when we celebrate the Lord's Supper, we do it with the synoptic gospels. So it actually is Passover celebration. That's what Jesus was doing. So I find it kind of fascinating that John kind of twisted it a little bit.
To me,
We forget that.
to me, the communion is like in our reading that we do, or that we give, is a reminder of
Yeah.
what we agreed to when we became members, we were baptized.
Do this
So
and
the-
remember.
Yeah, but when you say the dedicate was more less in remembrance and more oriented to the future of the coming kingdom.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of like that.
Well,
Together again from the ends of the earth into thy kingdom.
Yeah, that concept's been lost, even with us.
Yeah. You know, she talks about kosher means they drained all the blood from the cow. And so the idea of drinking blood would be totally
Yeah.
you're a Jew, yeah. Kosher Jew.
to me too.
Yeah.
Of it that way.
Well,
Don't become a Messiah.
other cults, if you want to, in their worship, they had something similar to communion, and that was kind of typical for groups to have something. But anyway, there was a philosopher, Justin Martyr, that he worried that the pagans would say, "Well, you're just copying our practices." And Mithraism was a popular religion at that time. It had existed in Persia, now Iran, long before, but it was reinterpreted by the Romans so it would be more acceptable to the Roman world. And one of the big things about their rituals was sacrificing a bull. And then after the sacrifice, they would have a banquet, eat meat, bread, drink wine, and the priest told them, eat the blood, flesh and blood of their God. So that's kind of
You what?
sticky.
Yeah.
Pagels says, though, it wasn't uncommon for there to be a ritual meal, whatever group you're in, as part of your worship. Another little parallel she pointed out just in passing was that Mithra was born on December 25th, according to their belief, and that by the 4th century, Christians were attributing Jesus' birth to be on the 25th. So anyway, I want to make a comment. Go ahead.
The Romans had a Saturnalia, which occurred on the 25th, and the Christians decided to have their celebration so they wouldn't be so obvious to the neighbors.
Okay.
Is my understanding.
Okay.
Well, and I don't know whether this is true, but I have heard that it was to replace a pagan. Okay.
Was that sort of syncretism there where they kind of absorbed some pagan dates just to,
Just to make it less obvious.
yeah, the solstice, yeah.
It's kind of close to it. Right.
Well, what did Justin Martyr say in response to people saying, well, you're copying, you're just copying pagan traditions? Didn't he say something like, well, no, they're copying us? They had I think that's what he was saying.
No, I agree. Actually, December 25th, you know, anything to maybe think people.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, then she gets into another big issue, was how can Jesus be a Messiah if he gets crucified as a common criminal? And then this goes into, so they're struggling with how to understand that. And then they started, so how do you view that? And so they, some writers viewed Jesus' death as a sacrificial offering, which is what James is talking about. And that made his death the center of their sacred meal or communion. By doing that, then what was a defeat looked like a defeat became a victory. And so his crucifixion wasn't a disaster like most Jews thought it was.
Especially since he told people that he was the lamb and that he was the sacrifice.
But that's only in John, isn't it?
well, no, Mark, I think that in Mark's version of it, Jesus had that knowledge too, you know?
Well, he faced his death,
Yeah.
but I don't think
He
he
knew he was
proclaimed he was.
Oh, no, not the resurrection part, perhaps, but definitely that he knew what he was doing and he was gonna, that Judas was going to betray him, you know? All of that is part of the Mark ritual.
So that's what I have. Mark, he moves deliberately toward his death because he said somehow it was necessary and he offered himself voluntarily.
Yeah.
So Mark and Paul have this sacrificial blood as ratifying a covenant idea. Mark says it's the blood of the covenant we calling Moses covenant, and Paul says it's the new covenant that's prophesied by Jeremiah.
Okay, then can I be a haircut? Is that just an ancient understanding of that still makes sense today? Did God require him to die before he could? I think that's a valid point.
The sacrificial victim.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't here 2,000 years ago. This probably made sense in their universe and their understanding. I'm not sure it makes sense today. That's for me. I'm not saying you all have to agree with that. So, I didn't.
At that time, they were practicing animal sacrifices. I mean, that was, I think everybody, almost every religion at that time practiced a sacrifice involving killing something.
Well, when they killed the lamb, did they then cook it and eat it? Or did they just burn it out?
The priest ate it. I don't know if the one who offered the sacrificial lamb ate it, but I think the priest did.
I'd get kind of tired of them.
Well, I think they had, if that's your case, then I think they also offered like
It kind of depended
some
on.
birds. Didn't they have some kind of,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, they're doves and
Yeah,
Doves, yeah.
you can switch your diet there.
The times when they sacrificed
Green beans, somebody said green beans.
cattle too, didn't they?
Yeah, see,
That's
a calf is gonna feed a lot more people in the land.
Yeah.
the
So, yeah, I mean, they didn't,
Uh,
but depending on what you were sacrificing, what your offerings were about were what the animal was.
So we have these different views of sacrifice, which different understandings. One view was Jesus was the Passover lamb, he delivered his people, like Moses delivered his people. And this idea of sacrifice became the Orthodox view in the New Testament. That's why the Nag Hammadi, when they found that library of stuff, that was hidden. It had been hidden for, nearly 2,000 years because it wasn't Orthodox. But the Didache, God is gathering his people from the ends of the earth into his kingdom. So these are different views of what communion meant. And sometimes people had more than one interpretation. She was saying in her book that they could have multiple interpretations. They didn't restrict themselves to just one view of what communion. They looked at from different aspects. But I think that's kind of narrowed down a little bit, particularly after the creeds were formulated.
Yeah, I was gonna say, as before the creed.
So you could look at Jesus' death as it is in the New Testament or in the Didache, or maybe you have another interpretation, or even, like I was saying, multiple interpretations, trying to understand what was going on there. Maybe one interpretation isn't adequate to explain what Jesus' death, which is what they were trying to understand.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting that they didn't. It was dangerous in the early Christian church to use the symbol of the cross, because then that was still very much the way they punished people, I mean, obviously we know, that's what happened to Peter. Unfortunately, that symbol was so confusing. That's how I look at it. It was like, so I didn't read which century they finally started using it again, but I found that was kind of interesting.
I don't think she actually said that.
Yeah, maybe next chapter. I'll let you know.
Didn't they use the symbol of the fish a lot?
Sure.
So I think that it was a symbol that maybe would stay for you.
Yeah.
Well, it relates back to the feeding of the 5,000. That, Jesus was feeding. Jesus was here to feed the soul.
When Pagel's son died 4 years later after she first entered that church, she says that, at least the way I read it, was going to that church, the rituals of the church all helped her to kind of like cope with her tragic situation, giving her comfort and support in her grief. But she says since the 4th century, most churches have required people to profess a complex set of beliefs, and many churches still recite a creed. There's more than one kind of creed. So we already talked about communion of Christ. We don't really say we have a creed. We've had a book called Basic Beliefs, and we've got the Enduring Principles. And Joseph Smith early on wrote his letter. Here's some of the things we believe that got that. So I think we're about done here. So these beliefs, now that you understand that there's more than one view of it, sometimes, the creeds make it all, here's the Orthodox view, and doesn't really recognize other options.
And that was after the Roman emperor said that it's okay to be Christian.
Yeah.
Then they got a creed.
Yeah.
I found that interesting too. It probably would have been one of those religions that were struggling until the emperor decided. to
When they
hedge
got
his-
the
hedge his
official
bets.
okay,
Yeah.
Then it became a government sanctioned religion.
so the Gospels we found in, there's several Gospels, not just the Gospel of Thomas in the Nag Hammadi discovery, shows us a wide range of Christian thought that we previously weren't too much aware of. The closest you knew about it was when some of the early writers would write against those other groups. And you picked up bits and pieces of what these other groups might be thinking just by in how they attack their view. Oops. Where am I now? Let's see. And so Pagels, then she likes some things about Christianity, but there's some things she doesn't like. And two things she didn't like was this single authorized set of beliefs and that Christianity alone offered access to God. That was her things she didn't care for in Christianity.
They call themselves the seekers, people who are searching for the path that they could find.
Yeah.
Well, I think when the Catholic Church became really organized, they took it away from the people.
Yeah, you
And
couldn't,
people couldn't go to God themselves, they had to go through the priest. And so they had,
it became an authoritarian
yeah,
religion. I think that's what the early,
yeah,
that's what the early Christian church did to it, the movement, which I thought was, it frustrated all those seekers, I mean,
yeah.
that's why the first 400 years must have been fascinating, because they're all getting together, arguing about who Jesus was, and
Well, and I
and
think
nobody could agree, so they kept writing about it, and
Does this sound familiar?
I know,
And that bothered Constantine. He wanted unity and peace, and
he found it. He
so he
killed
kinda-
and he killed the ones who disagreed with him. There you go.
so anyway, the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library has changed a lot of our viewpoints about I should put in about early Christianity.
Yeah.
In this book we're studying, Pagels is going to look at the Gospel of John in the next chapter and the Gospel of Thomas, and we'll see how that goes next week.
Guess who won? Spoiler alert. Book of John's in the Bible,
Yeah, that's like my two Jewish friends, well, I've got more than two, but two Jewish to me, like, where I live, and the discussion often goes, now, Phil, what is it we believe
Well, they say where two or three Jews are collected, there's at least three different views.
I know, I love that. They still have that sense of debate. I mean, that's what I've always loved about my Jewish friends too. It's like,
Yeah, that's what
you know,
that's what the rabbis did.
that's what
Yeah.
they still do.
Well,
That's
and
what,
they have
that's,
that book where you can still write your opinion in it.
yeah, Paul talks about that. That's really, that's the kind of the whole premise of it now.
Yeah.
The rabbis get together and discuss. That's what we're kind of doing. That's what we're doing here.